can humans see something else other than their patterns in the day, how they go about their day, to step back enough to see that there actually is another potential where they might become a vessel of some kind for spirit to enter them.
Welcome back to MindMatters, everyone. Today we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Susannah Hays. Susannah is an American artist and educator. She's currently working as a independent researcher advising the Entropy Institute. And recently we became aware of you, Susannah, through a comment she made to one of our shows about Gurdjieff and polyvagal theory. And so then we got in contact with you, and hopefully we will be discussing some of those subjects and your take on them. So to start out with, welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to meet you.
Welcome.
Thank you both.
So the show we did was on some of our kind of speculations on the connections between some of the material that we had been covering on the show and reading, specifically Gurdjieff and his exercises. We had Joseph Azizi on a couple times to talk about those. We were reading James Carpenter's First Sight Theory about a psychological theory of psi phenomena, and then a book on, or influenced by, both, polyvagal theory by Stephen Rosenberg. What was it called? Unlocking the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve, I believe, something like that. So we were talking about some of the connections between these various systems and how they kind of fit together. Now, we weren't aware at the time, but we found out that years previous to our show, you'd actually made some of these very topics the subject of your PhD dissertation and some papers you'd written. So maybe could you talk a bit about how you got into this and how you managed to find these different streams of material and put them together in the way that you did?
Yes. We're talking really about a living, lifelong question that I had when I was 4. And it came out just like in almost a burst, because I really seem to have this question in me, because it's now 50, 60 years, almost years later, that I'm still not so much asking the question as wanting to know how to take responsibility. So there's quite an arc. And I asked, why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? And apparently, children ask questions like that. But I'm emphasizing that this was a treasure hunt in me, that was real. And I'm surprised by that from time to time. But that's how it appears. And so there's a long, circuitous route where certain things sort of seem to be part of the question and other things don't quite satisfy. And I would say 50% of my ordinary life was holding back for this can't be it, or that's not the whole story. Yeah. So though my father was a scientist and worked at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, and therefore at 4 years old, I knew, that Albert Einstein was a cool character in this question. I will just fast forward to 1992-3 when I happened on the Gurdjieff work. And I say happened because it wasn't planned. It wasn't anything I was searching for specifically. I was literally just walking out of my dark room on Potrero Hill, where I was living and working at the time. I'm now in Santa Fe. And there was this movie theater that had been purchased by a group from Berkeley that was moving their group to Potrero Hill. And I was simply attracted to a kilim, a rug that was hanging over the banister, and I asked someone who owned it, because I knew that it was special. I knew it was a Senna rug from Turkey. So that's what I mean by treasure hunt. It's because I'm somebody who is peripatetic. I walk, I'm engaged, I look for lived experience, and have done that all my life. So one of the key principles of the Gurdjieff aphorisms that he gave was take the understanding of the East and the knowledge of the West, and then seek. That was an aphorism in one of his books, Views from the Real World. And I think that that has shown up as a real truth now that I have also understood something about Stephen Porges' work.
Mm-hmm.
So why does that work is now the question. What did Gurdjieff mean when he gave us that as a guide, one of his guiding principles? And I think that's why we've come together.
Mm-hmm. Right, because, or did you want to finish your thought, or can I interject there?
That's where we are, I think, at the moment. So yeah, sure,
All right.
Whatever.
Well, I think one of the advantages, or one of the directions to go from that aphorism, is that I think there's a tendency in a lot of either religious traditions or spiritual traditions to get kind of locked into a system, right? And to then not seek for anything outside of it or anything new. Not to say that there's anything wrong with with any of those systems per se, but there is constantly, I think, new understandings to be gleaned from new information. And so Stephen Porges is just one of those guys who has come up with or who basically revolutionized or kind of I wouldn't say rediscovered, but discovered something new about the body, about the autonomic nervous system that has so many implications and so many applications. And so one of the reasons I appreciate your kind of transdisciplinary approach is the ability to look at these disparate sources of information and to like the way I see it, it is almost like a continuous treasure hunt, like you said, that there are always new bits of treasure out there to discover and then kind of integrate into one's developing view of the world and the way things work and the way we work, and then to apply them and see what can happen and what can be done with them. So I just wanted to give that perspective on how I see just the very process of looking for information, seeking it out, and then kind of distilling those bits of goodness, the essence out of that can then be incorporated into a worldview that can help foster one's own self-development and the spreading of that, the education of others. Did you have any comments on that, or do you want to get into some specifics about Porges's theory and how that kind of integrated into your own view of things?
Well, I guess I first want to just reiterate the aphorism so that we really hear it. Mm-hmm. And it is take the understanding of the East and the knowledge of the West, and then seek. So what does understanding mean, and what does knowledge mean? And as East meets West, I mean, we know that as a theme for many centuries between the principle of embodying knowledge, understanding knowledge, which means that you're underneath it, that it's not just a thought, it's not just a philosophy, it's a practice. And then the knowledge or the research or the empirical methods for measuring and so forth. I think it was Gurdjieff's feeling that what appeared or was called mystical in the Eastern traditions is really not mystical. It's not even spiritual per se. It is that we are looking for, in the West, we're looking for information that is rational from the mind, and can be measured. And, Descartes and this mind-body split was basically that we can't be rational unless we have actually proven through science. And so we have a split. We have a problematic discourse in the West and also in the East because they need to be unified. So we're studying the ideas in practice in situations of reality as an embodied practice when we take a principle and then we try to see, when the rubber hits the road, how it actually goes. Mm-hmm. And we're at this point, as I point out in my paper that was given in Romania in 2018, it's a distillation of the doctorate, which, it's 10 pages versus 144. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was meant to clarify simply what we've measured and how the view of evolution and that we are still evolving as humans. We are humans in quotation marks, until we have begun to advance this unifying force of our phylogenetic history. And that's not new to science. I mean, Walter Hess brought that, and Hewlings Jackson, even Leonardo da Vinci, and we can even point to Goethe, which is the history in that short paper that I gave in Romania that gives this crucial timeline as to why we are now in front of not a metaphysical approach any longer, but stepping into the embodiment of practice. And there you go. I mean, you have a question?
Well, is our radio working okay? Are you hearing me okay, Susannah?
I am.
Yeah? Okay, because I'm not hearing myself on the headphones. But what I wanted to say is, I really appreciate what you just said about the idea of you can even just take the mystical element out of all of this and look at it all from a very practical, day-to-day appreciation of human potential, and a basic understanding, combining the ideas of the East with the knowledge of the West, of just optimizing the functioning, the very normal, built-in functioning of the human being, with this knowledge of vagal tone and consciousness and awareness, and that presented in such a way, I think it has the potential to be much more accessible to many people who might otherwise be more resistant to these ideas for not appreciating Eastern mystical ideas of spirituality or human growth or development. So what you're doing, as I see it, is bridging all of these kinds of seemingly separate ideas and saying, no, look, this is actually the elephant being described from all these various positions around the elephant. All of these guys are basically, and gals, are saying or describing the same situation or state of humanity or the individual, via their own perspective, but it all kind of there's this congealing of knowledge. It's like a synthesis that I think people can use for themselves in saying, if I'm able to pay attention to my awareness and my vagal tone and these ideas, I can, in potential, bring myself to a higher state of functioning and in better relationship, perhaps, with the people I'm surrounded by, with my community, with ultimately, the hope is the world at large.
Right. So the sphere that I use to bring these together, the East and the West, the phylogenetic history with the Eastern traditions of practice, was the Transdisciplinarity Movement, which centers in Paris, and it was something that occurred in the 70s when quantum field, cybernetics, different things were moving through Paris, where education and the riot of 68 at the Sorbonne and, education was being questioned for its 17th century model and not moving to contemporary time. And so it's taken over 100 years, almost 150 years, to digest some of these discoveries from Darwin, Einstein, and the quantum field. And there's now a resurgence because technology is taking over the measuring. It may actually be putting science to the side. So these are all real concerns, and of making sure that we're understanding embodiment, because the speed of technology is going to take us further and further away if we don't get this human aspect taken care of, in terms of educating people as to not just know thyself, but know thy biological self.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally appreciate, the emphasis on the pragmatic principles here that are simply observable, verifiable. They're not a belief system. We inherited them. We didn't ask to be born, as Terry Lindahl is famous for saying. We have a inborn natural default system, which Hewlings-Jackson makes clear, and Leonardo observed, and of course Galen, who was doing the anatomy description, called actually the vagus the reversive nerve before it was called the vagus. I mean, it was known to be a long wandering 10th cranial nerve in the body, but what they couldn't understand, or what they needed to observe, and this is when it was cadavers, not x-rays or imaging, they actually watched to see how this bidirectional system functioned, whether or not the impulse was coming from the heart or from the gut. And the fact that it actually started in the middle ear, and that it's lodged, it's it's back of this part of your trigenital nerves of your jaw and in the facial muscles. So the short history that I give in the paper about Darwin and facial expressions and different things concerning vocalization and moving these chords and the prosody of voice and, for instance, chanting and the things that were going on in the Eastern traditions that Porges identifies as being all vagal exercises. Mm-hmm. They didn't probably understand exactly what the science was, and science doesn't understand that it required a practice.
Right.
And then the dogma started to come in to interfere with both. Mm-hmm. Do it in remembrance of me, do it for someone else, so this belief system made the whole thing opaque.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So here we can actually now look at what the West required, which was proof, and then see how it goes when you actually try something specific, like an exercise during the day, where you can begin to see what is naturally occurring as friction against the harmonic tempos that might otherwise be there if one had vagal tone developed in one's system.
I wonder.
One more thing. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm just saying
no problem.
that the crucial part of this is that reaching any higher normative levels of being in education, in diplomacy, in politics, in anything, this duality that we live, where we're in a fight, or like or dislike, or any of these dualities that are otherwise catastrophic in our decision making. We are not able as humans to resolve our conflicts.
Yeah, without this practice, essentially, right? So, there's a couple different directions I wanted to go with that. One, just what you mentioned about the chanting and a lot of these, in the terms of our discussion today, what we might call Eastern practices that are rooted in a kind of an understanding that isn't that doesn't have that Western analytical kind of take it apart and understand each bit and why it works. Doesn't have that element to it. Well, that's in contrast, like you said, to the academic papers that lay everything out, but that don't have the practice. And then I just wonder, this might be, I don't know if this has been done before, maybe it has, but it might be a good research project to measure some of the efficacy of certain practices with and without understanding. Now, I know this would be hard because with or without the knowledge that goes into the scientific kind of explanation for why things happen. Because if you look at a group that's been doing like practices for their entire lives, well, first of all, they're going to be better at them because they have more practice. No pun intended. But in a Western group, or just a group of people who aren't familiar with the practices, I wonder if there's any benefit to having the scientific understanding of it in addition to the practice, as opposed to just the practice itself. I'm just throwing that out there. That's just something off the top of my head. But what that leads me to is that one of the advantages to taking this approach is that you mentioned this history that it's kind of like been a catastrophic history for the modern world, and that stems from this Western scientific understanding that we have this dualism, that we've been separated from the practical, from the practice, from the things that would allow us to overcome a lot of the problems that we face personally and interpersonally on all levels. And so this approach is almost taking a backdoor towards making things better by utilizing our very kind of scientific framework and understanding to then show that this actually has a benefit. This is grounded in science. It's something you can feel justified doing because you can place it in your kind of Western philosophical tradition mindset, and then go from there, as opposed to just converting to a different religion and kind of forgetting about using your critical, like, rational mind. So I know that. Well, just one more comment on this this kind of process or dynamic. When you read Porges's work, like I read Polyvagal Theory back when it came out in a book form, because I hadn't read any of his papers before then, but then they were collected all into that volume, and it's really hard to read, right? It's really dense academic writing, and sometimes you have to read luckily it's repetitive, in each paper bits get repeated, so you can kind of get it. But it's not going. A book like that isn't going to get anyone to, or isn't going to get very many people to implement polyvagal theory into their own lives, right? It takes someone to then translate it into a more practical teaching method, and then give it that way. So what? If you're okay with it, I want to kind of move the conversation in the direction of actually implementing some of these things. Maybe can we do that for polyvagal theory? Maybe could you talk about just some of the very basics understandings of polyvagal theory and how that actually can be integrated in the life of someone who isn't already aware of it?
Yes. So if I can first summarize, I think one of the things that you're asking as a very good specific question is, why do we need to have the ideas or the principles or the understanding of the science?
Yeah.
Can't we just sit on a pillow and meditate?
Yeah.
Or do join a chorus, start developing prosody of voice, and learn to exercise, different parts of the vital organs. This is where the Gurdjieff ideas are probably, I think, completely unique. Not that he gathered them from different parts of the Eastern traditions. And then the pre-Socratics and others obviously agree with a great deal of the material as well. So to have a philosophy is an important step in developing a point of view. Mm-hmm. And you can read all kinds of different philosophies. And I'm mostly speaking to you now at this moment from exactly what occurred with my own question and how things began to finally turn around. And I haven't written an autobiography about this, but there were some very good directions that I received from certain individuals. I was wondering what I could become. And, it was either going to be Terry in his inimical, humorous way, baked potato, you can become a baked potato, or, you can evolve your being. So in the Gurdjieff ideas, nothing is separated. It's the movements, it's the principles and the ideas, and it's the sharing of what actually occurs when I try an exercise to see how my organism, my being, is in relation to either the question, the principle, or an activity, an everyday activity. We are a laboratory for this process based on what we might hear as an idea, what we might try as an experience, and how others that we share process with might contribute to seeing what I deny, what I automatically refuse. So these defense patterns that come from our somatic biological apparatus, that are earlier brain systems that are meant to learn to become repurposed or unified with our neocortical capacity. Porges gives us some very good biological, physiological, biopsychological principles, which, if you have struggled to understand the Gurdjieff ideas, from my point of view, after all the years working to understand why I didn't remember basic principles when I was in motion, is that they happen too quickly. They happen too fast. You have, according to Hewlings-Jackson, a split second before the system itself just defaults to the lower brains. So together, it's not really even a bootstrap philosophy. We're talking about recognizing and recognizing as I work to see that it's not something I need to blame myself for, but understand that this organism has to make an effort to acquire and advance what naturally is friction against what I like and my habits and my potential to find and work between in a new space where I might get a glimpse of a way of not going with just what automatically goes on. And it's a time-based, chemical. We have a toxicness in us that's coarse, and we're working to refine. And this is chemistry.
Well, one of the terms that you used a short while ago and is included in your paper, Nature as Discourse, Transdisciplinary and Vagus Nerve Function, is the sense of bidirectionality, that we are both, through our efforts against or awareness of our friction, or the conscious exercising of our vagus nerve via breathing or chanting or whatever mode one chooses, that there is this effort to act upon our own physiology, and the physiology and its own natural response in turn on our awareness. So it's this kind of, and I'm just working out this idea now, and I'm hoping that it can be fleshed out further. But there's this kind of positive reinforcement or a positive feedback loop, which seems to be suggested here in first being aware of our physiology and the way that our vagus nerve has all of these different impacts on our organs and on our awareness and our brains and hearts. And as a result of working on it, in a sense, we get the benefits. There's a kind of a I don't know if cleansing is the right word, or a tone, but it just seems to be it makes for a greater potential and health and expansion. It maybe is another word that may be used, but I wonder, Susannah, if you might expand on that or help me say what I think it is I want to say there.
Well, so the Entropy Institute in San Francisco, we are trying to establish how the humanities as a whole in the university environment could begin to understand that a course is needed in this to begin with.
Yeah.
That we are not saying we should change the disciplines per se, but everything that's being studied has to adapt to some of the principles that we're discussing right now as a whole entity. That the mind that's going to get hold of any idea is going to process it with the mind that it has, which isn't sufficient at this point, unless one has also incorporated an understanding of where that perception has already formed, already has its opinions, already has its judgments, already think it knows. And even myself right now speaking, you know, I have a lot of my own, what I'm saying, in reserve, in observation, because words, you know, they're a tricky business, language itself. And so this is a semiotic change as well, that we're evolving through. Our language might begin to also change. So as a species, we have still a great deal in front of us to understand, but if it isn't understood through these principles of my ordinary habits, my preconditioned opinions, if we're not open in our way of working through how our environments need to change. I mean, one of the very specific things that Porges's work outlines for us is that unless the body feels safe, unless we are able to communicate in safe environments, which, you know, universities are not on the whole. They're highly competitive. They're rigid in creative approaches. We have autocratic department heads, and, you know, I mean, we've all had our experience, but most of everything that I've actually learned has come from the fringes of the university. Mm-hmm. And I was an older student returning, so I had what Gurdjieff said. I had the understanding of the East that I brought with me to the university environment and learned to experience the trepidations of what the university was about. So until we have safe environments, the body is not in a situation that can learn. And what we're also trying to invert, I think, are the principles that all that this study through science goes either into therapeutic prescription drugs, which also is a huge, you know, issue within just treating those who are in trauma, those who are living in borderline conditions that end up in terrible circumstances, of which Porges has dedicated his life towards. But now we see that it comes from the leadership. So we need to train and to teach people who are going to go into the field of education, into the field of early childhood. What do mothers need to know is basically the question we started with when we started the Institute in San Francisco, so that we're not backtracking, trying to always correct what's already been damaged in the potential. And now we have an environmental situation which is full of its criticalness, and so that you can see that across the board, we take it out on the natural world of which we're part of. So it's not very pragmatic, is it?
No.
Right.
But that's when you mentioned at the beginning of that answer that you gave, you mentioned the need for a course in these sorts of things, and then you also mentioned the words can only go so far, and then there's really a lot of damage done so that it's very hard to reach most adults because they have their ideas about everything already. Most adults aren't very open to new ideas and just anything new to be introduced into their lives. So, but when you first mentioned the course, that the first thing I was thinking was to start as young as possible. I was thinking, well, we need courses in like elementary school, in the and even before, like you went even further and said, well, it should start with mothers, right? Mothers should be aware of certain principles, certain practices, certain things to understand and to look out for, because we really come into this world. We come in totally unprepared, and then we realize that the people around us are just as unprepared as we are, even though they're, they've got a lot more experience than we do. They're our parents, they're our teachers.
Right.
That's. Go ahead.
We need an owner's manual.
Yeah.
That is clearly substantiated now by the empirical measurements that were required by the authorities, let's say. And then of course there were those of us who were artistic and creative as children that couldn't respond to that authority, and so we suffered a certain emotional deprivation when we were young, that I can attest to from having taught now in the art schools. The inner life and emotional life of creative children particularly everyone is we could speak of the intellectual not being able to feel, and we could speak of the emotional not being able to construct their thoughts in a way that can be accepted by somebody who wants reason.
Mm-hmm.
And the moving centered type that is very quick within the body to perform and be athletic and to be strong and to be capable of doing many things, but not able to register how their tempo works with others and so forth. So we are mostly gifted in one direction or another, and the possibility of becoming bidirectional with being able to feel your thoughts and think your feelings right there becomes a step. And so these principles are teachable, and in order to have them established within a broader community from esoteric practices, let's say, the way they've been viewed as mystical and so on, because we don't need to say that any longer. We have the proof of the system. Contemporary science now gives us the pathway, shows us the vagal pathway, and that our fear-based activities are real to us until we learn to negotiate in a new perspective of what else might be possible.
Well, I'm just looking at your paper here and how you go back through some figures in history, as was mentioned earlier in the show, and cite some works by Darwin and John Hewlings Jackson, Paul MacLean, and the well-known Stephen Porges. And it seems to me, especially with Porges, that you read what he's presented with his research and certain and you've made these certain connections to fourth way thinking and and personal growth using his work. And there's a tendency I find with some ideas to think, oh, we really have it now. It can't get any better than this. If most people understood this, then we'd reach our a state of equilibrium at the very best.
But this is the one.
It's really, it brings so many things together, and I guess this is this brings me to a question which may include some some other ideas that you've been thinking about. Maybe not. I don't know. But I wonder, in a more perfect world, Susannah, if all of these ideas were assimilated, as this is a attempt to do, what do you imagine might be the next level of development for mankind? It's kind of a broad question, and maybe difficult to answer. But what do you see as the next? What is the next level of thinking on all of this, as all of this gets integrated in a world that doesn't have authoritarian universities, that doesn't have reactive people who are closed-minded to taking on new information? Where does all of this go in a more constructive and open-minded and perfect world?
Well, we're a long way from nirvana, but there are obviously some very key things that would make a significant difference. We're speaking of ultimately that why are we here, which was what I asked my father. And to speak of evolution and Darwin as he gave me the Beagle and his travels, the book, why wasn't that a satisfying answer for me? Only. So we're meant to evolve, and the evolution of consciousness was something that I was interested in. But why are we here? The answer is that I have a purpose. There is an organic film on the earth of which I'm part of, as nature foresaw. And I'm meant to be vibrating at a certain rate, a finer rate than I was born with. My work, my effort is to become something so that our solar system is helped by its purpose in keeping life going. So as I learned to move through my own personal story and narrative of this thing and the other thing that happened, I could be asking this larger question. That would be a tremendous achievement for humans, to begin to recognize that they're here for a short period of time, and for generations to come after them. We carry a responsibility in that regard. Some people won't get to that perception of a worldview until they begin to see the authority inside themselves. And so when we speak of, the authoritative education, we need to be taught. This doesn't come naturally. We need to understand this system. It's right that we have struggled to find this reality in the Western world. We can intuit many, many things and understand that something's not quite right about war or genocide or, some of the really egregious things that could still happen today and are happening today, even in the 21st century. Where have we evolved to? What is this struggle about? Well, there really is a struggle. I mean, we're talking about a very thick medium in our beings that develop what we call the 7 deadly sins. So our institute is setting a bar for a project that shows visually as an art exhibition that is the gestation, history, and potential of humankind, which Terry Lindahl has beautifully created. It's on permanent view at the Institute. Of course, we're semi-closed given the pandemic, but I think by appointment now people can come to see that. We would like to have that become a major exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, or at the DeYoung, which is across the way from the Academy of Sciences, so that we can begin to really look at the phylogenetic story that humans carry. You know, how you go into those science academies and, you know, you see the evolution of the ape to man and so forth, but there isn't a taxonomy that's been made visual for the general public. I mean, this is a major, major, big story that's been left out. You know, since the ascent of man, we really haven't had an exhibition like this. So that's available to us now. And Stephen Porges came and viewed the exhibition. There are conversations that have been recorded and transcribed. And these are the materials for Stanford University and the Humanities Department, or, you know, whoever is willing to look at the pre-Socratic history that was part of, say, St. John's College here in Santa Fe, that teaches these very early understandings before art and science were separated, before art, science, and religion were separated, where alchemy was understood. We can now go back, in other words, to these prehistories that had all the very, you know, in the timeline of humanity's search. And so we have put this together. I mean, this is what our institute has been working on Terry for the last 50 years, and for me, 30 years. So it's a very important history yet to be told.
That sounds great. Does that tie into what you were talking about earlier about possible courses? Like, was that more of an idea that you just think needs to be implemented, or have you guys actually developed like material for teaching to young mothers or to students? Like, where are you in the actual development of any of those materials, if that's what you're doing?
Right. Well, we have the treatise of this is Harmonics of Unity treatise, which has been translated into Portuguese and Spanish, and it's available on Amazon, which gives the overview.
Okay.
The biggest overview. And then we have a program initiative, which is something which we would like to review with universities that are looking for a way to establish a core curriculum that would be blending an otherwise divisive or fragmented approach to education from the point of view of what the humanities generally suggests. It's educating students that fall short of the purpose of why we're studying what we study. If we're looking at the humanities from the point of view of becoming more human, we need all the information of the biology department, the technology people, the science, the art, the religion groups to come together for a central purpose of evolving our species to adapt. And therefore, it needs to become also an experiential practice. It needs to be something that one can observe in a safe environment to recognize that what they think they know is not actually occurring in the moment. it's coming from memory or from rote learning, which are facts and information, but are not part of an experiential understanding of how I need to learn to take responsibility for my own actions. It won't come from a ruler or a punishing system, or even our legal, those are becoming just economics of disregard for what the real problems are.
Well, I haven't seen any of your artwork yet, Susannah, but the idea that you would conceptualize these ideas into a visual representation could, and I'm sure this was part of the intention, could help people to grasp or ascertain these ideas in a very different way. It just sounds like a very creative way of making these ideas accessible. And there have been a number of paintings and things I know that I've seen over the years that have expanded my conception of something that opened my thinking to the possibility that maybe energy exists in this way, or maybe these kind of ephemeral ideas that are sometimes difficult to describe and to define. So I can only imagine, because like I said, I haven't seen your artwork yet, but it just seems.
I need to correct you, just that, this is Harold Terry Lindahl's art.
Yes.
He was trained as an architect. He was influenced by the organic school of Frank Lloyd Wright. His teacher was Bruce Goff. He studied the laws of sacred geometry. These principles that are in architecture then became his study in his triptych series, reciprocating triptych series, which if you go to his website, haroldterrylindahl.com, you can see the whole trajectory of this project, which is a life's work studying objective art, what it means to move from talent, which many artists have a great deal of talent, to begin looking at what we could actually have as a radiating force of education towards our human condition. I mean, this is what's unique about art. It could be about anything and be about for art for its own sake, but if we're coming to principles of ideas that would actually transpire into culture, we might even be able to work through methods of appreciation that sees somewhere on a scale where my own creative evolution could contribute to the body of work that started with cave drawing. What was cave drawing about? And where are we today? That in itself is a very interesting question for an art history department to look at from the point of view of why do we create? Which has, lots of books have been written about it, but I'm saying go back again now, look from the principles of what Porges is telling us about our biology. Take the science seriously within the scope of what was that first inclination to draw an animal on a cave wall. I mean, from my own perception of what I experience when I've processed these ideas, the thought occurred to me in an interview that I did with an art historian, Dr. Peter Sells and Terry, back in 2011, before we knew of Porges's work, actually. I had this impulse that came from I don't know where, but it was that there was enough in the Neanderthal, the position of man becoming man from animal, that it saw enough of itself not as animal to draw an animal. I mean, stick figures of humans were being drawn, but there must have been a kind of aha moment there where man could see himself as separate from animal in order to take that crayon and draw. So that's a separation. Now, can humans see something else other than their patterns in the day, how they go about their day, to step back enough to see that there actually is another potential where they might become a vessel of some kind for spirit to enter them? That is a jump from Porges's material to something beyond behavior and social discourse, where one might actually be able to receive impressions, where our creative force can then manifest to its full potential. I mean, that goes beyond what Porges's material actually, I mean, everything else can move from a gyre. That's what he's saying. From understanding how the vagus learns to discern, given a period of space or pause between reaction and real thought, something that's not coming from memory, neuroception, from my chemical makeup, but I actually have what's called, as you've brought, vagal tone.
Just a slight diversion on the topic of cave painting. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with the work of, I can't remember the author, but one of his books is called Inside the Neolithic Mind, and the other one is the one on the Paleolithic cave paintings. I can't remember what that one's called, but I think his name's like David something Williams or something. But you'll find him if you just search Inside the Neolithic Mind. But his idea, he looks at all of these paintings from the perspective of altered states of consciousness, not in the sense of like hallucinogens or anything like that, but just kind of more of a shamanic perspective. And those books kind of blew me away. And I'd recommend checking them out for an additional like perspective on that shift where we actually became, what we think of as human back then. And I'd recommend.
We would definitely like to be having the Institute. We would definitely like to be having these conversations with people who are deans of universities, deans of humanities departments, to begin to put together in conversation and dialogue the real implications of what we're able to discern at this point. How there really is no point to continuing all these separate disciplines of action until we look at what is viewing, what perceptions are guiding the decision makings that are going on, that are obviously keeping us in a horizontal predicament. And the transdisciplinarity movement in itself has to think this way, because their principles, their philosophy, the approach of the third, or the missing third, or the hidden third, or however we refer to this potential, this third force, this third possibility that comes from the two, we need to look at the implications of where we're obviously going to just repeat and continue on the same. And I think Yvonne had just mentioned the idea of energy. I mean, we are wasting energy. We are inefficient as individuals, as our offices, and everything that we're doing during the days. If we don't take the regard of these principles, I mean, it's a really big statement to step back and recognize how we have this wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we're losing our ground now, and it's more evident than ever to a larger population. So that's just another reason why we feel that this no longer has to stay within sort of esoteric boundaries, limits, that it's time now. And this is what I think Gurdjieff would agree, that science has met. I mean, he was alive when Hewlings Jackson made the Crunian lectures. He could have heard those, he could have seen those, but he was, I mean, he uses the word evolution as a central word. So teaching evolution in the schools has been a battle in itself that still goes on in parts of our country, right? But now that we have the full evolving principles of our adaptation, our own personal adaptation, it needs to be part of the systems view thinking, which are, people like Fritjof Capra, people who did films like Mind Walk, where you have the three conditions of the scientist, the poet, and the politician trying to work together. We need Oprah. We need people who can broadcast this very, very simple. I mean, I'm happy that it's happening on a garage recorded radio interview. It could be no better place, really. But the signals need to be out there. And that's why the exhibition is very important as well, because that's what art can do. It can be the signal to humanity to begin to appreciate that all the years of study and research have come to something, and we better heed it at this point. And that's the only reason why I'm taking this risk this morning to speak to you, because it does step out of all of our boundaries. If it's science, if we're transing to transdiscipline, we're talking about moving beyond. And science has had this history of wanting to do something for humanity, but it was caught in, I mean, David Bohm had to leave the country. I mean, the quantum field that he was trying to resolve between the theory of relativity, those papers were hidden by Oppenheimer. And only just in the last year has the Pari Institute in Italy broadcast to thousands the Infinite Potential film, which tells that history. So our ability to find a new tempo within each of our beings is the work of what an individual can do, and then collectively, as a whole, humanity can serve its purpose.
Great. Well, I think that's a good note to close on, Susannah. Well, thank you for being on with us, and thank you for talking, and for doing this. I think your first interview, at least on YouTube. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. But before we end, I want to ask you, because You've come on here to talk about these ideas. You've got the exhibition going on at the Institute. You also have a conference that's coming up. Could you tell us a bit about that conference and some of the details about it?
Yes, the transdisciplinarity community that is centered in Paris is the organization that is sponsoring with 3 or 4 other organizations in a World Congress. On October 30th, they will be starting a 42-week virtual weekly program with people contributing papers and activities towards their specific areas of concern, whether or not it's the environment or education itself or Indigenous people, or, I mean, there's a list of speakers that goes the whole gambit of areas that need to cross to new understandings. It's based in Mexico City because of the pandemic. It's virtual. How do I convey the registration for that? Can I do that with you afterwards, or will you post it?
Yeah, I can put details in the show description. So if you send me whatever links and whatever text, information that's relevant, I can put it in the show description.
So our institute is sponsoring one of the weeks. It's in February. It begins on the 30th of October with Basarab Nicolesco, the man who wrote the manifesto of transdisciplinarity. It's something which presents the theoretical ideas of Romanian philosopher Stephen Lupasco, Franco-Romanian, and the third potential, moving beyond dialectic. And we say moving beyond because we mean we are including it, but we're also establishing a third. So it's not that we're doing away, but we're actually including the third potential here, which isn't it isn't interdisciplinary. It's about integrating, but it's about a synthetic approach to all the disciplines. So it's not multidiscipline. It's actually thinking in terms of what problems are needing to be solved in the world and working from there back about what knowledge we need to have. So, there are people like E.O. Wilson who've brought this idea of consilience, where the humanities would have a way of educating the whole rather than parts. And there are any other number of different models that are out there. But this is the community that is trying to take action. And we have UNESCO as one of the partnering groups. We have C-Trans, which is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we have the Mexico City Anthropology Museum and Paris working together. So it's a very large community of world effort in dialogue. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, looking forward to it. And you've got, just so our viewers know, I believe Joseph Azizi is going to be speaking in that week that you guys are putting on, right?
Yes,
in
he
February?
is.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, we'll include...
And Harold Terry Lindahl and Stephen Porges.
Yes.
It's going to be pretty much laying out, I hope, what we would like for humanities departments to adopt.
Great.
But of course, that'll take years probably. Yeah. But if we have a sufficient number of people interested in what we're doing, it would help move things along in the Bay Area and in smaller, maybe university settings like St. John's College that already has libraries established and things that would be harmonious with the art exhibition at the cultural museums in this country.
Cool. So. Great. All right. Well, thanks for the details, Susannah. And thanks again for joining us today and and sharing
Thank
with
you.
us and talking with us.
It's a real
Thank
pleasure.
Thank you both.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.